What about the one league the NFL looks at and says, we want to be them? Joining us here on the show is a man who has written a book, co-authored the book, The Club, How the English Premier League Became the Wildest, Richest, Most Disruptive Force in Sports. He has written for the Wall Street Journal as well and covered sports for WSJ. Jonathan Clegg joins us this morning on the show. Jonathan, good morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How you doing?
Good.
So, as somebody who grew up in England and you have seen the NFL try to push NFL football there for more than a decade, we always talk here on this side of the pond about if a full-time NFL team could work out there. I wonder every single day if it would work. In your estimation, do you think that is a possible thing that could happen years down the line?
I mean, I think the success they've had in the last sort of 10 years when they've really made that sort of renewed commitment to try and push the NFL in London, I think you'd have to look at the results of that experiment and say, yeah, I think it probably can work. There will be obviously logistical hurdles to overcome, but you're talking about 4 games a season being played in London now. That's half a home schedule for an NFL fan base. You get 16 games a season, 8 at home. So if they're selling out 4 games a season, that's half a home slate. You have to think that an additional 4 games, you'd have to say they'd probably sell those games out too. And in that case, that starts to look like a viable franchise. How it would work, I've always thought, and I spent a couple of years covering the New York Giants for the Wall Street Journal, including when they played over in London. And I've always thought that the answer would be to have the team sort of play its home games in London, but be based for the off season in, Florida or somewhere on the East Coast. So the team would sort of operate in London during the NFL season, but all kind of other off-season activities, possibly including training camp, would probably be done here in the U.S., which would clear up a lot of the sort of problems about tax loopholes and that sort of thing that would arise if they based the team in London full time.
On your point about that slate, you're right. 4 games in London is half of a home slate, and if they could sell out 4, who's to say they can't sell out 8? My question is, in terms of an appetite from the English fans, selling out 4 games that have interesting, different matchups, isn't that a little different than trying to sell out 8, let's say, Jaguars games, that you're getting a Jaguars-Colts game, a Jaguars-Texans game, a Jaguars-Titans game? Would it still have that appetite, do you feel, if it's one team?
I think that's a great question. I think, in all honesty, if you look at some of the matchups that they have sent over there, they have not been the best and the brightest of the NFL. I can think of some real duds that they've sent over there. A Dolphins-Giants game that was sort of finished 9-7 or something like that. So English fans, a hardy bunch. They've turned out for some pretty low-key matchups in the past. Whether that would, how they would sort of survive if, there was if the team was, in the basement and really struggling week to week, how much enthusiasm there would be for that over the course of sort of 2, 3, 4 years if a team struggled early on. I think that's, a question that they have to consider. But I think the fans, the turnout at Wembley Stadium for these games has been pretty resilient. The one thing I guess that you'd have to question is, a lot of the fans that go to those games go as NFL fans. You see jerseys from all 32 teams represented in the stands, and those fans are sort of there to show their allegiance to the NFL, if you like, to the field, to the NFL game. And if it were one team based there permanently, would those Redskins fans or Vikings fans or Raiders fans go out to watch the Jaguars at home every weekend? That's a question that they have to consider too.
Yeah, that's all good points. Jonathan Clegg, the author of The Club, How the English Premier League Became the Wildest, Richest, Most Disruptive Force in Sports. Before I get to that, I just want to ask you about the makeup from a sports appetite standpoint in England. Why does the NFL work in England versus any other parts of Europe? I know that there was a sense that there was success in Germany for NFL Europe, but really across Europe, the NFL doesn't really move the needle. What makes it different in England?
That's a good question, and one that I've sort of puzzled over in the past too. I think there's a couple of things. I think the NFL established a foothold in England in the 1980s, so sort of 30 years ago now, when at a time when, and this is something that we actually discuss in the book, at a time when English soccer was at a real low point. There was sort of violence and hooliganism plaguing the games. The stadiums were very dangerous and unsafe. And for one season, the game actually disappeared from TV screens because of a breakup in negotiations between the teams and the TV broadcasters there. English soccer wasn't shown on TV in England. So the NFL started being shown on TV there at that time and really took off because it was a complete antidote to everything that people were disappointed with English soccer. This was a sort of super loud, colorful, exciting game. It's like the sort of epitome of Americana, felt so different to everything that they were used to seeing back home. And so I think that the fact that it established a foothold then has really helped it now, because those kids who grew up watching the NFL on Sunday nights, as it was then, in the UK, they are now the adults who are going to these games, taking their own kids along. So I think that helps. And then I think there's something about the English kind of sports culture and tradition that helps too. When you look at the UK, Britain versus the rest of Europe, very few other they play sports that sort of are related to the NFL, even though they're not exactly the same. So you have rugby, which is big in the UK. That's not really played anywhere else on the continent. And if you look at the NFL and sort of squint a little bit, you can kind of see how its origin started in rugby still. The ball is the same shape. There's the sort of same sort of hitting and tackling techniques that you see. So I think that the British sports audience is sort of more accepting of the NFL, more kind of used to what they're seeing. And so the combination of those two factors meant that Britain has sort of worked as a sort of test case for international fandom, whereas Spain, Germany, as you mentioned, the Netherlands, where they hosted an NFL Europe team, those places weren't quite so successful.
Jonathan Clegg joins us from the Wall Street Journal, author of The Club. And the book is fascinating because the English Premier League has just taken the sports world, the business world, the globe by storm over the last 25 years. And it's the one league, I think, internationally, the NFL owners aspire to. I think the NFL owners feel completely proud and confident in everything that they do, but they look at the English Premier League and say, how can we derive revenues like that? How can we do things like that? But the flip side actually was the case. How did the 20 owners of the English Premier League look at the NFL and say, we want to do that 25 years ago?
Right, which was something that I had no idea about until we started reporting this book. But it's incredible how much the NFL was a blueprint for what the Premier League did. As I mentioned, the English soccer in the 1980s was was going through a very difficult time. There was, fan violence. This was not a game that was in any way a sort of viable global entertainment product. But for a small group of guys, 4, 5, 6 guys, young guys who own teams and sort of had ambitions to do something more with English soccer, they looked across the Atlantic and saw what the NFL was doing. And they not only took sort of broad business ideas from the NFL, the idea, for instance, that you should sort of consider the league to be first and foremost a TV product, that getting this thing on TV in households around the country was the most important thing, and that the sort of live experience was secondary to that. So they took those sort of broad business ideas, but they also were shameless in ripping off like much smaller and sort of more granular details that they saw in these stadiums and loved. They took Monday Night Football wholesale, saw the success of that in the U.S., just ripped it off, brought it back, established a Monday night game, which had never existed in English soccer before then. The owner of Manchester United came over and watched the Jets play the Raiders and was so enamored with the Raiders and Al Davis and their cool black uniforms that he went home, and the following season, Man U started wearing black jerseys on the road. So everything about the NFL, they were consumed by and trying to make a product that could match that. And that was the impetus for forming this breakaway league. They in 1992, the owners of the top 20 English teams broke away from the rest of English soccer. And they'd been tied, previously all 92 teams had been tied together in one sort of vast league over 4 divisions. But the top division broke away. They set up their own league and decided to sell and market their TV rights themselves. And that really was the genesis for the Premier League's success. In the following 25 years, they were able to sell their rights for bigger and bigger fees. Every sort of new cycle, the TV rights fees skyrocketed. And we get, eventually we get to the stage now where the Premier League is this huge sort of global behemoth that is shown in 185 countries around the world every weekend. There are only 192 recognized by the United Nations. So almost every country on earth shows the Premier League every weekend. And as you say, that is something that the NFL owners, and there is a small group of NFL owners who also own Premier League teams. And every time the NFL owners meet for their owners' meetings, these guys form a little caucus and meet up over dinner to discuss what they can take from the way the NFL is doing business and bring it back to the UK. But those guys, the NFL owners, the one thing that they are jealous of in terms of the Premier League is its international reach.
And we've seen the incredible growth by NBC Sports Network and NBC and its family networks broadcasting English Premier League here in the States. And ratings are good and revenue is good, and that continues to grow as well. So it has certainly worked here in the States. The club, Jonathan Clegg, is the co-author of this book. And you mentioned some of these American sports owners that have gone to the English Premier League. John Henry owns the Red Sox. He owns Liverpool. Stan Kroenke owns Arsenal. Kroenke owns a billion, seemingly, teams here in the States, including the Los Angeles Rams. The Glazer family as well, who owns the Buccaneers. Out of these American business titans, who's the most unpopular across seas? Because let's face it, it's never popular for somebody from a different country to walk into the English Premier League and plop down the money and the cash.
Right, exactly. And, the Manchester United were sort of the first team to fall to U.S. owners. They were bought by the Glazer family in the early 2000s. And that takeover was phenomenally unpopular, in part because of the way the Glazers bought the team, which was loading a bunch of debt onto Manchester United in what's known as a leveraged buyout. But, Manchester United has actually been very successful under the Glazer family and carried on winning the Premier League and the Champions League trophy. But even today, you see Love United, Hate Glazer stickers on the seats at Old Trafford Stadium. But I think the one owner who's more unpopular than anywhere else is actually an owner who has since sold up, which is Randy Lerner, the former owner of the Cleveland Browns. He bought Aston Villa Football Club in Birmingham, a century-old team which had a long history of success. And he actually went over there and tried to hide his American background in some ways. He refused to do TV or radio interviews because he knew that some of the locals might find the idea of an American accent somewhat confusing or somewhat displeasing when they heard the owner of their team talk in a way that sounded foreign. So he was sort of active about trying to hide his American background, or at least trying to conceal it from the fans. But he found the Premier League to be so chaotic, and the way that business was done there to be so unfamiliar with what he was used to in the world of U.S. business, that after 4 or 5 years, he sort of washed his hands with the team, turned the running of it over to somebody else, and ultimately got that team relegated. One of the sort of great problems that American owners have when they go over to English soccer is sort of reconciling and coming to grips with this process of relegation, whereby the worst teams in the league are demoted to the minor leagues every season, and the best teams from below come up to replace them. It's a financial catastrophe to have your team relegated. It can cut the value of the team in half or even more. But that was the fate that befell Aston Villa under Randy Lerner. And we tell the story of Randy Lerner in the book. He actually spoke to us in his first kind of major interview about his experience in English soccer. And we published an excerpt from that in the Journal last weekend, and the vitriol that we still hear from Aston Villa fans 3 years after he sold the team is remarkable.
The Club is the book. Hate to cut you off, Jonathan Clegg, but we're up against the break right now. The Club is the book, how the English Premier League became the wildest, richest, most disruptive force in sports. Jonathan, great job with this book. Thanks so much for joining us.